Margaret Hill stirred the pot of potato soup slowly, watching the thin broth bubble and steam as it simmered over the weak flame of her old gas stove. The kitchen smelled faintly of onion and pepper, a scent that might have once evoked warmth and family dinners, but now hung in the air like a ghost of better times. Outside, the wind howled through the leafless trees, rattling the brittle glass panes of her small, rented house. Snow had begun to fall that morning and was already covering the ground in a thin white blanket, promising a quiet but bitter Thanksgiving. She moved toward the window, holding the spoon in her hand like it was a relic of something sacred. From behind the faded curtain, she watched a few neighborhood kids tossing snowballs, laughing in the distance. Their laughter rang out freely, echoing through the narrow street, unbothered by the cold or by the burdens of grown-up life. Margaret smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. She had once had children who laughed like that, children who clung to her apron strings, who cried for bedtime stories, who whispered secrets into her ears. But that felt like a lifetime ago now. The small kitchen was modest, bordering on barren. A single yellow light bulb flickered above, illuminating the chipped tiles and mismatched dishes stacked in the sink. The refrigerator hummed, mostly empty save for a carton of milk, a few eggs, and a half-used stick of butter. On the counter sat 3 pie tins, each filled with a crust she had carefully made 2 days ago, hoping against hope that maybe, just maybe, this Thanksgiving would be different. Margaret had sent out handwritten invitations to each of her children a week earlier, not a formal letter, just a note from a mother's heart. Alan, Christine, and Robert. She had written their names with such care, folding each letter and sealing it with a stamp she'd saved from her grocery store reward points. In the note, she'd mentioned the soup, the pies, the warmth of the fire she would light if they came. She hadn't written it out loud, but it was meant to be an invitation to reconciliation. A peace offering, a mother's plea, and yet her phone hadn't rung all week. She moved to the table and sat slowly, her joints stiff from age and years of undernourishment. The chair creaked beneath her, the only sound in a house that once roared with joy and chaos. Her eyes wandered to the 3 folded napkins on the table, each placed next to an empty plate. She'd done it out of habit more than expectation, but now they mocked her with their silence. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. 5:05. No one was coming. Her heart weighed heavy in her chest, not just with sadness but with a lingering question. Where had she gone wrong? She had worked tirelessly when they were young. She had packed lunches with care, attended school plays, and kissed scraped knees. She had waited at hospital bedsides through the night, sacrificed meals to ensure they ate, and pawned her jewelry when Alan wanted to go to university. But that was before things fell apart, before the layoffs, the foreclosure, the debt that grew like mold in the corners of her life. The truth was, Margaret had lost everything after her husband James passed away. It had been sudden, a heart attack on a quiet Sunday morning, and the world had not paused to help her catch her breath. She went from being a homemaker to a widow, from a mother to a burden. The savings were small, the bills enormous. Within months, the bank had taken the house. Alan had offered her a place briefly, but Christine had objected. Robert had gone silent. Slowly, they all drifted away, not with malice, but with a cold indifference that burned more than cruelty. Margaret didn't blame them, not entirely. The world didn't teach people how to treat someone who had nothing to give. It taught them how to chase success, how to climb ladders, how to smile at cocktail parties and keep uncomfortable truths tucked behind closed doors. She didn't fit into that world anymore. She was no longer the proud mother in a church hat, but a woman who wore the same winter coat for 8 years and washed her clothes in the sink to save on electricity. She rose again and walked over to the oven, opening it with a soft sigh. The pies were still warm, apple, pecan, and pumpkin. She'd made each with care, using recipes passed down from her own mother. She had even braided the crust edges with her shaky hands, remembering how Christine used to watch her do it with fascination. "It's like magic," she'd once whispered. Margaret had smiled then and said, "It's just love, darling. That's the only real magic." Now that magic felt spent. She cut a small slice of the pumpkin pie and placed it on one of the plates. It looked almost comically lonely beside the empty glasses and unused forks. She sat back down, folding her hands in her lap. The silence around her pressed in tightly, and for the first time in a long while, she felt tears sting her eyes, not because she was alone. She had long gotten used to that, but because of how deliberately she had been erased from their lives. Asterisk, she remembered the last conversation she had with Christine. It was over the phone. Christine had just gotten a promotion at her marketing firm and was throwing a housewarming party. Margaret had offered to bring her famous lemon bars. There was a long pause on the phone, and then Christine's voice turned distant. Mom, it's not really the right crowd for that kind of thing. It's a professional gathering. You understand? Margaret had said nothing, but she understood. She understood perfectly. Asterisk, the doorbell did not ring. The phone did not buzz. The snow outside thickened. Margaret sat there, the soup cooling in the pot, and thought about what it meant to be forgotten. Asterisk, it wasn't death she feared, it was this slow, cruel erasure. The kind where you still breathe, but no one calls your name. The kind where your life becomes a footnote in someone else's success story. She wasn't angry at them. Not really, but she was tired of begging for crumbs of love from a table she had once built with her own hands. Asterisk, she pushed the pie away and stood up again, moving toward the bookshelf in the corner of the room. It was small, but it held her most precious items, a few framed photos, a stack of recipe books, a small music box that James had given her on their 5th anniversary. She opened it, and a soft, trembling tune began to play. You Are My Sunshine. She closed her eyes and let the music wash over her. Asterisk, suddenly, her stomach growled, reminding her she hadn't eaten all day. She walked back to the stove, ladled a bowl of soup, and sat down again, alone. But, for the first time, the silence didn't crush her. It simply existed, like the snow outside, like the ticking clock, like the air she breathed. Asterisk, somewhere in the corner of the room, the mail she had picked up earlier sat unopened. Among the bills and notices was a small, colorful envelope advertising the state lottery. She glanced at it but didn't move. What use did she have for dreams, anymore? Asterisk, still, the envelope caught the light just right, its golden lettering glinting like a whisper of hope. She stared at it for a long time, letting the warmth of the soup settle in her chest. Asterisk, Margaret didn't know then that everything was about to change. That fate, cruel and distant for so long, was preparing to knock on her door, that this bitter Thanksgiving would be her last spent alone. But for now, she sat in the quiet, waiting for nothing, and yet, something was waiting for her, hidden in plain sight, a moment that would shift the very axis of her world. She just didn't know it yet. Asterisk, the next morning, the sun filtered faintly through the old lace curtains, casting fragmented patterns across the small living room. Margaret Hill awoke to the sound of her creaky radiator hissing half-heartedly against the chill. She stayed in bed for a few more minutes, listening to the quiet. There was a kind of peace in it, but also a kind of aching, like a wound that no longer bled but still hurt every time it was touched by memory. Asterisk. She pushed back the blanket, slid her feet into her slippers, and walked slowly toward the kitchen. Her bones ached more than usual. Age wasn't kind to those without comfort. She made herself a cup of tea with the last bag in the box, stretching it thin with extra water. No sugar, no milk, just warmth. The calendar on the fridge was flipped to November. 4 red circles marked 4 days. Her children's birthdays. She always remembered theirs, but none of them ever called for hers. Asterisk, on the counter lay a single crumpled dollar bill. That was all she had left for the week. Enough for maybe a loaf of bread or a box of cereal if it was on sale. Her pantry was almost bare. There were some rice grains at the bottom of a bag, half a jar of pickles, and a few potatoes beginning to wrinkle. She knew she'd make it last, just as she always did. She had gotten good at stretching time and food and energy at making the impossible last just a little longer. Asterisk, Margaret wrapped a scarf around her neck and bundled herself in her oversized coat. The cold was biting as she stepped outside, her boots crunching against the icy path. She carried a canvas shopping bag, the kind she used to take to the market when James was alive. Back then, it would be full of fresh produce, bread still warm from the bakery, cheese from the local farm stand. Now, it mostly stayed empty. Asterisk. She walked past rows of small houses, some neatly maintained, others with peeling paint and sagging porches like her own. A few neighbors waved. She nodded politely, but didn't stop. Most people around here were kind enough, but kindness didn't fill an empty stomach. She walked the 2 miles to the corner discount store. The snow had turned to slush, and her feet grew damp through the cracks in her boots. Asterisk. The store bell jingled as she stepped inside. The warmth and fluorescent lights washed over her, but they didn't make her feel any less tired. She moved quietly between the aisles, scanning the shelves. Everything looked a little more expansive than she remembered. Even the off-brand cereal was a stretch. She held up the box and squinted at the price tag, calculating mentally. $1.29 plus tax. Her heart sank. She only had $1. Asterisk. She shuffled through her pockets in vain, hoping for forgotten change. Nothing. Just a tissue and an old receipt. She sighed and turned to leave, ashamed but resigned. Then she saw it. Near the checkout counter, there was a plastic bin marked clearance, damaged boxes. In it sat a slightly crushed box of bran flakes with a bright red sticker, 89 cents. Her heart jumped a little. She grabbed it and took it to the counter. The clerk was young, chewing gum, barely looking at her. He scanned the box and tapped the register. 96 cents, he said. She handed him the $1. He gave her 4 pennies back without a word. Asterisk. Margaret clutched the bag close as she walked back. The wind was stronger now, sweeping through the trees and whipping against her coat. As she walked past the bus stop, she paused to sit on the bench. Her legs were tired, and the plastic grocery bag felt heavier than it should have. She looked at the cars passing by, wondering where they were going, who they carried, and if any of them had ever felt forgotten. Asterisk. Beside her on the bench was a newspaper, folded in half and damp at the corners. She picked it up out of habit, brushing the snow from the top page. The front page was about rising unemployment and gas prices. On the back was a garish ad for the state lottery. The numbers from the last draw were printed in bold, under a picture of a smiling couple holding a check for $12 million. Asterisk. She stared at it for a long moment, then chuckled softly. She'd never played the lottery. James had called it a tax on the hopeful. Still, it wasn't hope she lacked. It was the belief that anything different could happen. Yet there she was, holding a box of cereal rescued from the clearance bin and reading about someone else's miracle. Asterisk. Just as she was about to toss the newspaper aside, something else caught her. Aja discarded lottery ticket lying in the snow, just under the edge of the bench. It was damp, folded, and slightly torn. She picked it up, more out of reflex than interest. The paper was thin, the ink smudged, but the numbers were legible. It looked like someone had bought it and then thrown it away without checking. Asterisk. She tucked it into her coat pocket. Asterisk. The rest of the walk home passed in a kind of fog. Her legs moved, but her mind stayed on that ticket. She told herself it was nothing. A used ticket. A piece of trash. But still, a tiny voice in the back of her mind whispered, what if? Not because she believed in fairy tales, but because when you had nothing, even the impossible felt worth entertaining for a moment. Asterisk. Back home, she placed the cereal on the shelf, put the kettle back on the stove, and retrieved the ticket from her coat. She smoothed it out and laid it on the table next to the newspaper. Her old eyes squinted at the numbers, tracing them slowly. First number, 06, second, 14, third, 29, fourth, 34, fifth, 41, power number, 10. She looked at the ticket, 6, 14, 29, 34, 41, 10. Asterisk. Her breath caught in her throat. Her hand froze mid-air. She looked again, more carefully this time, as if the numbers might change on second glance. But they didn't. They matched. Exactly. Asterisk. She sat down hard in the chair, her knees suddenly weak. Her heart pounded in her chest, like it was trying to break free. Her first instinct was disbelief. It had to be a misprint, or a mistake. Maybe she had read it wrong. She read the numbers out loud. She checked the date. The draw was 2 nights ago. The ticket matched the winning numbers completely. Her fingers began to tremble. Could it be real? Asterisk. She remembered a time when Christine had lost the gold bracelet and turned the house upside down looking for it. The panic, the obsession, the disbelief. When it was finally found under the sink, Margaret felt that same surreal sensation now. She touched the ticket again. It felt real. Damp, cold, but real. She had to confirm it. She turned on her tiny television, the kind with rabbit-ear antennas that only got 3 channels on a good day. She flipped through until she found the local station, which was re-airing the winning numbers from the last draw. She sat forward, holding her breath. Asterisk. There they were. The same numbers. No doubt she had just become a multimillionaire. Her first reaction wasn't joy, it was fear. Her mind rushed to a dozen things. What if someone came looking for the ticket? What if it belonged to someone else? What if it was invalid because it was found? She didn't know the rules. She barely understood how the lottery worked. Asterisk, but a small ember of excitement flickered inside her. Slowly, it grew. The kind of hope she hadn't felt in decades. She thought of what she could do. Pay off her old debts. Buy a home. Help the shelter she used to volunteer at. She could travel. Eat something besides cereal and soup. She could be someone again. Asterisk still. She told no one. She folded the ticket carefully and tucked it inside the Bible on her nightstand. The same Bible James had given her on their anniversary. She didn't sleep that night. She lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, running numbers through her head, imagining what life might feel like with air that didn't weigh so heavy. Asterisk in that moment, Margaret didn't care about designer clothes or lavish parties. She didn't dream of yachts or sports cars. What she wanted was warmth, dignity, and maybe, just maybe, a seat at the table again. Asterisk, but this time, not their table, her own. Asterisk, the wind had softened by the next morning, and the sky outside was the color of old porcelain gray and still, like the world had paused. Margaret Hill sat by her window with a mug of weak tea cradled between her hands. She hadn't slept much. The lottery ticket, folded neatly and tucked into her Bible, felt like a secret too large for her small world. Every few minutes, her mind circled back to it. The numbers, the match, the check she hadn't yet claimed. It sat in her thoughts like an unopened letter from fate, terrifying and magnificent. Asterisk. She had always been the sort of woman who'd do everything. She reread grocery lists, counted coins twice at the counter, and used threadbare notebooks to keep track of bills. It wasn't anxiety, it was survival. When you lived life on the edge of necessity, precision became a form of hope. But now, for the first time in years, she was no longer worried about the price of bread. She was worried about what came next. Asterisk, and that fear wasn't about the money. It was about them, her children. Asterisk, a knock on the door would have been too much like a miracle, but her phone had remained quiet. Even after the invitations for Thanksgiving had gone unanswered. She had still hoped faintly, irrationally, that maybe one of them would call. Maybe Christine would feel guilty. Maybe Robert would check in, but silence had a way of making its point, and Margaret, in her core, had begun to accept that she no longer held a space in their lives. Asterisk, that acceptance, however, was about to be tested. Asterisk, later that afternoon, as she returned from picking up her prescription from the community clinic, Margaret stopped by Christine's house. She hadn't planned to. In truth, she had avoided their neighborhoods for months. But something in her stirred. Maybe it was the cold. Maybe it was the aching reminder of how long it had been since she saw her grandchildren. Or maybe it was the weight of the ticket hidden in her coat, whispering promises of power. Asterisk, Christine's home stood tall, polished, and pristine. A new car gleamed in the driveway. A golden wreath hung on the front door. Through the large bay window, Margaret could see a perfectly trimmed Christmas tree blinking softly with white lights. The scene was something out of a catalog: warmth, success, stability, and yet it felt more foreign to Margaret than any place she'd ever known. Asterisk, she straightened her scarf, smoothed down her coat, and climbed the steps. Asterisk, the door opened after a long pause. Christine stood there in a cashmere sweater and fitted slacks, holding a wine glass in one hand. Her perfectly styled hair was pinned to one side. She blinked in surprise, the faintest flicker of discomfort passing over her face. Asterisk, Mom, she said, like the word itself was foreign. What are you doing here? Asterisk, Margaret offered a small smile. I was nearby. I brought you something. Asterisk, she held out a small box inside it. A homemade apple pie, her daughter's favorite. She had baked it that morning, just in case. Christine looked down at the box, then back at her mother. Her jaw tightened. Asterisk, we have guests, she said quickly. I wasn't expecting company. Asterisk, Margaret's smile faltered, but she steadied herself. I won't stay. I just thought maybe you'd like some pie, like old times. Christine didn't take the box. Look, it's not that I don't appreciate it, she said, her voice sharp around the edges, but things are just really busy right now. You can't just show up. We have standards to keep. The words sliced through the cold air like a blade. Margaret's hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from something deeper, an ache she had carried for too long, now pressed into the space between them like a third presence. She slowly lowered the pie, her eyes never leaving Christine's. Asterisk, I used to bring this to your school bake sales, she said quietly. You once told your teacher I made the best pies in the world. Asterisk, Christine's face remained expressionless. That was a long time ago. Margaret stood there for a few seconds longer, as if hoping the warmth from the window would somehow spread to the doorway, but it didn't. The door remained half open. Christine, standing like a gatekeeper to a world she no longer allowed her mother into. With a nod, Margaret turned and walked down the steps. As the door shut behind her, she heard the muted sounds of laughter from inside, distant, filtered through glass. She paused at the end of the driveway, her breath forming clouds in the air. She held the pie to her chest, not knowing what else to do with it. Her arms ached from the cold. Her heart ached more. On the way back to her neighborhood, Margaret passed a man hunched over a shopping cart, pulling a blanket tighter around his shoulders. He looked up as she approached, his face red from wind and rough living. Without thinking, she stopped and handed him the pie. It's fresh, she said gently. He blinked at her, surprised, then took it with a trembling hand. Bless you, he said. She nodded, then kept walking, her heart heavier but her hands light. Back home, she sat on the edge of her bed, her coat still on, the silence in the room pressing down like snow on an old roof. She reached for the bauble and pulled out the lottery ticket. She stared at it, the numbers like a language she was still learning to believe in. A part of her had dreamed, foolishly perhaps, that if she won, she'd be able to call her children and say, "I'm okay now. You can come back." That somehow money could fix what love couldn't. But today had shown her otherwise. Today, they had chosen status over blood, and now, she was beginning to understand that money wouldn't buy her back into their lives. It would only expose how easily they'd sold her out of them. She walked over to the small mirror above the sink and looked at her reflection. Her face was lined, her hair grayer than she remembered, but her eyes, they still held fire. Quiet, simmering fire. The kind that didn't beg. The kind that didn't need to be invited in. She didn't cry. Not anymore. She made tea. She wrote in her journal. She read a chapter of a library book. And that night, for the first time in years, she began to plan not out of desperation, but out of resolve. If the world had turned its back on her, she would build her own, not to prove them wrong, not for vengeance, but to finally live on her own terms. The next morning, she made 2 calls, one to a lawyer and one to a financial advisor. She didn't use her full name, just her initials. The ticket was real. The deadline to claim it was still weeks away. And Margaret Hill, the woman they disowned for being poor, was about to become invisible in the most powerful way possible. Not lost, but quietly, deliberately untouchable. The world didn't change in an instant. Not the weather, not the streets, not the people. The snow still fell, traffic lights still blinked red and green, and Margaret Hill's radiator still groaned in protest each time it came to life. But something in her had shifted. There was a new silence in her mind, not from defeat but from deliberation. A part of her that had always pleaded, waited, hoped for love, for approval, for acceptance, had finally gone quiet. The lottery ticket was more than just a winning number now. It was a key, but Margaret wasn't ready to unlock anything just yet. She knew better than to rush. Haste was for the young or the foolish. She had neither the luxury of youth nor the patience for recklessness. What she had was time, a worn notebook, and clarity. She sat at her kitchen table, the same one that had held too many unpaid bills and too few meals, and began to write. Not letters to her children, they had stopped reading those long ago, but notes to herself, plans, ideas, dreams, practical ones. She listed what she needed first. 1. A lawyer with experience in large asset claims. 2. A financial advisor who didn't flinch at the sight of someone in thrift store clothes. 3. A new identity, one not built around poverty or pity. By noon, she had circled the name of a legal firm in the city known for discreet handling of estate matters. She had clipped the name from a newspaper ad months ago, back when she still thought about creating a will no one would read. Now, she would give them a call, tomorrow. That afternoon, with her scarf pulled tightly around her chin and the ticket carefully secured in a zippered pouch under her coat, Margaret walked to the nearest public library. The warmth inside was a welcome embrace. The library was nearly empty except for a young mother reading to her toddler in the children's section and an old man dozing beside the radiator. Margaret went straight to the computer terminal. The internet was something she used spare to check weather forecasts or read news, but today, she was navigating sites on trusts, anonymous investments, tax shields, and how to claim lottery winnings without disclosing personal information to the press. Every click made her feel more alert, more grounded. She printed out 3 pages of notes and tucked them carefully into a folder she had borrowed from the librarian. As she walked home, snowflakes danced gently in the air. She felt oddly untouchable, like she was walking through the world with a secret no one could steal. The next morning, Margaret dressed differently. She didn't wear the oversized coat or the knit cap she'd patched up a dozen times. She chose a long navy overcoat she had saved from her husband's funeral, a coat that made her feel taller. With her hair pinned neatly and lipstick applied softly, she looked like someone with errands and intention, not a woman scraping to survive. She stepped into the city bus, paid an exact change, and rode quietly to the firm's downtown office. The building was sleek and gray with tall windows and white marble floors. She felt small walking through the entrance but didn't show it. She asked for a Mr. James Rourke, a name she had read was often associated with silent trusts. To the receptionist's credit, she didn't blink at Margaret's modest appearance. "Mr. Rourke has an opening in 30 minutes. Would you like to wait in the lounge?" Margaret nodded. The lounge was warmer than any place she had been in months. Soft jazz music hummed through hidden speakers, and the couch was so deep she nearly sank into it. She clasped her hands in her lap and waited without fidgeting. Exactly 30 minutes later, a tall, gray-haired man with wireframe glasses stepped into the room and greeted her with a calm smile. "Mrs. Hill." She rose and shook his hand. "Yes, thank you for seeing me." "Of course. Please, come in." Inside his office, which smelled faintly of leather and eucalyptus, he offered her water or coffee. She declined. Then he asked what brought her in today. She reached into her coat, pulled out the zippered pouch, and gently unfolded the ticket. "I believe this may change my life," she said simply. Rourke looked at the ticket, leaned forward slightly, and then reached into a drawer to retrieve a laptop. He typed in the numbers, checked the date, and paused. He blinked slowly, then looked up. "You're correct," he said. "This is the winning ticket." Margaret let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. "I want to claim it," she said, "but not as Margaret Hill." He nodded slowly. "You're not the first person to make that request. In cases like this, we often establish a blind trust. The funds can be transferred, invested, or held under a new entity's name. You retain full control, but your personal identity remains protected from public record. That's exactly what I want," she said. "I don't want my children to know, not yet." He tilted his head slightly. "Would you like to explain why?" Margaret smiled, but there was no joy in it. "They disowned me when I had nothing. I want to know who they are when I have everything." Rourke sat back in his chair, respectful. "I understand." He went over the process: signatures, documentation, notarization. Then came the appointment with the State Lottery Commission, which he would personally attend with her. The check could be processed within 2 weeks. Taxes would be automatically deducted. She would walk away with just under $30 million. $30 million. It still didn't feel real. They scheduled the appointment for 5 days later. That evening, back home, Margaret lit a candle and sat by the window. The pie tin she had left for the homeless man was gone from the alley where she had passed him. She smiled softly and whispered, "I hope you're warm tonight." She thought about James's quiet strength, his faith in hard work. He would have laughed at the absurdity of it all. She imagined him nudging her with his elbow and saying, "You always knew how to stretch a dollar, Margie. Now stretch 30 million. She chuckled out loud. The next few days passed in a blur of planning. Margaret began to close accounts she no longer needed. She cancelled her food stamps. She arranged for the local shelter to receive a surprise delivery of blankets and food, anonymous of course. She donated her space heater to the widow next door, telling her it was just an extra. Each small act made her feel lighter, less burdened by the years of scarcity. When the day came to visit the lottery office, she dressed carefully: cream wool coat, leather gloves, and a scarf James had given her 20 years ago. Rourke met her outside the commission's entrance. He carried a briefcase and moved with quiet assurance. The process was surprisingly short. They confirmed the ticket, processed the claim, and asked if she'd like to go public. No, she said without hesitation. A photo was still required for legal purposes, but it would be kept private. She signed where needed, smiled when asked, and left the building with a folder containing confirmation of her new identity, the Rosewood Foundation, a blind trust established in her name. Back in the car, Rourke looked at her. You don't have to live like you used to anymore, he said gently. You could be anywhere by tonight. I will, she said, but not tonight. She asked him to drop her off a few blocks from her house. She walked the rest of the way, her boots crunching against ice. The air was sharp, but she didn't feel the cold. She paused outside Christine's house again. The lights were on. Laughter drifted from inside. Margaret didn't approach. She just stood there for a moment, not with longing, but with recognition. They were still the same, but she was not. She turned and walked away, holding the folder close. That night, in her small room, with one lamp glowing beside her, and the silence folding around her like a soft coat, Margaret began to write again. But this time, it wasn't a letter to her children. It was a new beginning, and it didn't need their permission. The sun rose slowly, brushing gold over rooftops and frost-laced trees as if trying to melt away the weight of winter. Margaret Hill stirred her tea quietly, no longer counting spoonfuls or stretching out bags for a second brew. She used a fresh one today, and she allowed herself a small dash of sugar. It was a silent rebellion against the years she had spent rationing even the tiniest luxuries. Today felt different. Today, Margaret was a millionaire. The confirmation documents from the Lottery Commission sat neatly on her table inside a clean leather folder. Her name tucked behind the alias of the Rosewood Foundation. The money hadn't hit the account yet, but it was no longer just a dream. It was hers, protected, secure, invisible to the public and, most importantly, to her children. There was no paparazzi at her door, no journalists sniffing for a rags headline. That was the beauty of silence. She was free. Still, she didn't celebrate, not with champagne or shopping. Margaret understood that transformation wasn't about loud gestures. It was about control over time, space, choices. She hadn't had that in decades. She didn't pack her bags and vanish overnight. Instead, she moved deliberately. The first change was her home. The rented house she lived in, with the leaky roof and humming refrigerator, had served its purpose. She would not miss the creaky floors or the smell of mildew from the bathroom walls, but she didn't list the place or tell her landlord yet. Instead, she purchased a property in a nearby town under her foundation's name, a modest brick cottage nestled between two hills, hidden behind a row of pine trees. It wasn't grand or showy, but it had everything she ever wanted: a fireplace, a garden, a library room with sunlight, peace. The cottage came fully furnished, but she added touches of her own: a new tea set, woolen rugs, a handmade quilt from a local artisan. She filled the pantry with real food, spices, cheeses, fruits she hadn't tasted in years. When the delivery truck arrived with her first grocery order, she watched the young man unload her boxes with wide eyes and an open smile. He thanked her for the generous tip. She smiled back. No one knew who she really was. Margaret visited the town under a different name. Not Margaret Hill, but M. Rose, a quiet woman who claimed to be the administrator of a private charity. She wore simple but elegant clothes, warm fabrics, earth tones, always clean and fitting just right. She walked to the post office. She volunteered twice a week at the animal shelter. She even joined a book club held in a local cafe. People welcomed her without question. It was the first time in years she felt like a person, not a problem. But even as she settled into her new life, the past remained like a shadow that moved just behind her. Her children hadn't called, not after Thanksgiving, not after Christmas, not once. She didn't expect them to. Still, one January afternoon, she decided to visit Robert's office. Robert was the most financially ambitious of the three, always driven by titles, corner offices, the next promotion. When he was in college, Margaret used to send him $20 bills with handwritten notes, sometimes sacrificing her own meals so he could buy books or new shoes. He never forgot to thank her back then. He had always said, "I'll pay you back someday, Mom." He never did. She dressed carefully, that dyed camel-colored coat, leather boots, and a warm beret. She looked like someone important but not flashy, someone with purpose. She walked into the commercial high-rise downtown where Robert's office was located and headed toward the receptionist. I'm here to see Robert Hill, she said. The receptionist smiled politely. Do you have an appointment? No, she replied, but I believe he'll want to speak with me. Tell him it's M. Rose from the Rosewood Foundation. The woman made a quick call. After a few murmured words, she nodded. He'll be right down. Margaret waited by the polished marble wall, watching employees pass by in crisp suits and hurried steps. When Robert appeared, he was exactly as she remembered, tall, well-groomed, sharp-jawed, confident. He didn't recognize her at first. Ms. Rose, he asked, extending a hand. She took it. Thank you for taking a moment. Of course, he said. How can I help? I'm the administrator of a private foundation, she said, her voice steady. We're looking to invest in promising local firms. I understand your agency recently expanded into environmental consulting. He blinked. Yes, actually, that's correct. We're always looking for strategic partners. We prefer to invest quietly, she said. No press, no names, just impact. Robert nodded quickly, his demeanor changing. That's exactly the kind of partners we want. Discreet, efficient. Can I offer you a coffee? She declined. I won't take much of your time. I've reviewed your firm's public filings. Your numbers are promising, but your last quarter took a hit. He looked surprised. We're still stabilizing after an acquisition. She opened her folder. Inside was a printed check, a mock investment, already signed by the foundation. It was for $1 million. She didn't hand it to him. She simply let him see it. Robert stared at it. Then he looked at her again. I can't promise anything now, she said, standing. But if we do move forward, it'll be on the condition that the company's direction aligns with our principles: integrity, sustainability, and respect for legacy. He nodded slowly. I understand. Absolutely. She offered her hand again. Thank you, Mr. Hill. We'll be in touch. As she turned and walked out of the building, she didn't feel smug. She didn't feel revengeful. She felt balanced. She had spoken to her son, and he had no idea it was her. And yet, for the first time in years, he had listened to her. That night, she called Rourke. I'd like to purchase a commercial property, she said, downtown. We'll turn it into a resource center, job training, housing support, elderly care. Name it after James. It's done, Rourke said without hesitation. The following weeks passed in a series of quiet, powerful gestures. Margaret funded the local women's shelter under the name of a different woman every month. She paid off struggling teachers, medical bills. She anonymously sent art supplies to underfunded school districts. Each act made her feel less like a ghost and more like a guardian, unseen but present, forgotten but formidable. She did not reach out to Alan or Christine, but then, one day, a letter came. Not from her children, but from Christine's eldest daughter, Ava. It was handwritten in careful, looping script. Dear Grandma, I don't know why Mom says we can't see you. I found your old letters. I miss you. I'm 13 now. I remember the stories you used to tell and the tea parties in your kitchen. Are you okay? I hope you are. Love, Ava. Margaret pressed the letter to her chest. It was the first real message she'd received from her family in years. A child's words, untainted, honest, remembering her not as a burden, but as a presence, a warmth. She sat down and wrote back, not as M. Rose, not as a stranger, but as herself. Ava, I am okay now. More than okay. I miss you too. Thank you for remembering me. That means more than you'll ever know. She sent the letter through a private courier. No return address, no trace, but she knew Ava would understand. Later that night, as she lit a fire in the hearth of her new cottage, Margaret reflected on everything she had endured, the silence, the betrayal, the invisibility. She didn't need them to come back anymore. She had rewritten the story, and in it, she was not the woman left behind. She was the woman who rose, quiet as dawn, fierce as fire. Snow had begun to melt along the curbs, revealing patches of gravel and forgotten cigarette butts. The sky was starting to clear, a soft blue, returning like forgiveness after a long stretch of silence. Margaret Hill stood at the window of her cottage, wrapped in a wool shawl. cradling a cup of chamomile tea. The air still had a bite, but spring was whispering its way back into the world. She could smell the thaw in the earth, feel it in her bones. Something inside her was thawing, too. The last few months had given her a life she once thought impossible. She had become invisible in the best way, moving silently through the world, affecting change without applause or acknowledgement. She was still the same woman who had once eaten canned soup for dinner, who had picked cereal boxes from clearance bins. But now, she held the power of choice, and with choice came clarity. Her investments through the Rosewood Foundation were growing quietly. The community center named after James was nearly complete. She had hired local workers and paid them fairly, ensuring the project lifted not just walls but lives. She received updates, weekly photos of progress, names of people helped, stories of mothers finding safety, students finding scholarships. Margaret read every word like scripture. But even as she nurtured a new world, the old one found ways to intrude. It started with a message. Rourke forwarded her a voicemail from Robert. "Ms. Rose, I hope this reaches you directly. There's been a shift in our firm's board. One of our investors withdrew unexpectedly. We're looking for a stabilizing partner, and I thought of you first. Please, if you're available to meet, I'd be grateful." Margaret read the transcript twice. She felt no glee, no revengeful twinge, just a steady, quiet curiosity. She decided to meet him again. This time, she asked him to come to a restaurant, a discreet French bistro she'd visited once with James, years ago, back when it was barely known. Now it had gained quiet popularity among discreet clients, artists, professors, retired politicians. She reserved a small table in the corner and wore a dark green dress with a pearl brooch. Her hair was neatly pinned, and her lipstick was the same soft rose she wore on her wedding day. When Robert arrived, he wore the same tailored arrogance he always had, though his eyes had darkened slightly with the weight of uncertainty. He saw her and smiled, offering his hand again. "Ms. Rose, thank you for agreeing to this." She returned the gesture. "I appreciate transparency. Mr. Hill, please sit." The waiter poured them water. They ordered politely. Margaret chose lentil soup and grilled trout. Robert opted for steak. Small talk filled the first few minutes, until finally, she steered the conversation. "You said your board was destabilized." He nodded. "Yes, one of our key stakeholders backed out, unexpectedly. We were expanding too quickly, I suppose. Grew confident. We need a short-term injection of about $2.5 million to keep certain projects alive." She sipped her water. "Why should I be that investor?" He hesitated, then leaned forward slightly. "Because we've proven our profitability, and because we remember who helped us during the last shakeup. You saw value when others hesitated." She didn't respond immediately. She studied him, his mannerisms, the flicker in his eyes. It was strange, watching her own child speak to her like a stranger, like she was a distant executive holding the keys to his future. She gently placed her spoon down. "Mr. Hill," she said, her voice soft but firm, "what's the last kind thing you did for someone who had nothing to offer you?" He blinked. "An act of kindness, something that cost you, with no reward." "When was the last time?" Robert faltered. His lips moved, but no words came. Margaret smiled gently. "It's okay if you don't remember. Most people don't." "I try to give," he said finally. I donate, through the company." "That's not what I asked." He fell silent. She nodded, and reached into her purse. She didn't pull out a check this time, but a card with the Rosewood Foundation's emblem. On the back, she had written a number. "Here," she said. "This is our grants division. Apply through them. No promises. We don't fund figures, we fund principles." He looked confused but took the card. The food arrived. They ate in a quiet, strange rhythm. After dessert, she excused herself and left him with the check. Outside. The air was brisk and clean. Margaret walked slowly along the street, past rows of boutiques and cafes, until she reached the park. She sat on a bench and watched pigeons, fluttered between bare branches. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt something better. Sovereign. Back at the cottage that evening, she found another envelope in the mail. This one had Ava's handwriting again. "Grandma, I got your letter. I cried when I read it." I showed it to Mom, and she got really mad. She said you abandoned us, but I know that's not true. I remember everything. The stories, the songs. I told her that I want to see you. I don't care what she says. Please, write me again. Margaret folded the letter gently and pressed it to her chest. The next morning, she called Rourke. I'd like to set up a scholarship, she said, for girls like Ava. Curious, brave, unafraid to love. Will begin immediately, he said. She spent the rest of the day writing pages of thoughts, memories, advice. She wrote about the day Ava was born, about the time she spilled juice on the carpet and cried for an hour. She wrote about love and forgiveness. She wrote what she wished her own mother had written her. She didn't mail it yet. She would wait. 3 weeks later, something unexpected happened. Christine called. Margaret didn't recognize the number. She rarely answered calls anymore, preferring to let them go to voicemail. But something made her pick up. There was silence for a moment, then a breath. Mom, Margaret froze. Christine, I found your letter to Ava. She showed it to me. I don't know what to say. Margaret said nothing. Let the silence work. I've been angry for a long time, Christine continued. I thought you left us, that you gave up. I was never the one who left, Margaret said quietly. More silence. You sound different, Christine whispered. I am. Are you okay? Where are you? Margaret smiled sadly. I'm exactly where I need to be. I miss you, Christine said, her voice breaking. Ava misses you. Can we see you? Margaret didn't answer right away. Her heart was full of emotion, but her mind was clear. I'll think about it, she said gently. That night, she sat by the fire with a book in her lap, the flames casting golden light across the walls. Her world had changed, not because of the money, but because she had changed. She had found herself again beneath all the years of rejection, the dust of poverty, the weight of being forgotten. And now, they were remembering. Not because she begged to be seen, but because she became someone impossible to ignore. Someone reborn, not in spite of the pain, but because of it. The days were longer now, sunlight stretching across the sky like a slow exhale. Margaret Hill stepped into her garden barefoot, the grass cool and damp beneath her toes. The tiny white buds she had planted weeks ago were beginning to bloom, their petals shyly unfurling in the soft morning breeze. There was a certain rhythm to her days, now a life of quiet ritual and gentle progress. No alarms, no rushing, no sharp corners of survival. She drank tea when she felt like it, walked when her heart called for it, and slept without fear of what tomorrow might bring. She had found something she never expected to rediscover at her age, contentment. But peace, Margaret had come to understand, was not the same as closure. Even as she moved through this new chapter of her life with quiet dignity, the past continued to echo in strange, sharp ways. The calls from Robert had increased, polite, careful requests for a second meeting. She hadn't responded. The letter from Christine remained unanswered on her writing desk. Ava had sent another drawing this time, a picture of Margaret holding her hand, both of them smiling under a tree. That one she had pinned to the wall. Then came a letter from Alan. It arrived in a plain envelope, handwritten, scrawled in the familiar slanted script she used to recognize instantly. There was no return address. Inside were only a few lines. No, we weren't there when you needed us. I don't know if you'll ever forgive us, but if you're still alive, and still my mother, please let me talk to you. I'm sorry. She read it 5 times, then folded it and placed it in a drawer. It was the first time in years Alan had acknowledged her pain. She didn't call him. Not yet. Instead, she turned her attention to something that had been building slowly in her Minda, desire not for revenge, but for reclamation. Margaret had lived her entire life building things for others' careers, families, comforts while quietly giving away her own needs. She had watched herself become invisible to the people she had given everything to. Now, she wanted to build something of her own, a legacy not for forgiveness, but for truth. She called Rourke the next morning. I'd like to buy a house, she said. A specific house. Which one? He asked. She gave him the address. It was her old home, the one the bank had taken, the one where she had raised her children, baked birthday cakes, read bedtime stories, and held James's hand during his last breath. It had been sold, resold, and was now listed for private purchase. A large hedge fund owned the deed but had recently posted it, quietly one of many underperforming properties in their portfolio. I'll pay full price, she said. No negotiations. Rourke made the arrangements. 2 weeks later, the house was hers again. Margaret didn't move back in. She didn't need to. It wasn't about nostalgia. It was about reclaiming space in the world that had once been her space. She had been forced out of. Space she had been made to feel unworthy of. She stood in the living room alone one evening, running her fingers along the banister, remembering Robert sliding down it as a child. She walked into the kitchen, touched the corner where Christine used to sit and doodle while Margaret cooked. In the backyard, she stood where James once planted tomatoes every summer. The house was quiet now, still, but it felt like hers again, not just in paper, but in spirit. That same week, she bought the apartment complex Alan was renting out as part of his real estate firm. It was barely turning a profit and had been on the market for 6 months. Through an anonymous investment channel, Margaret made the purchase without ever revealing her name. Within days, Alan received a notice. The building had been sold. All leases would continue, but ownership had transferred. She didn't evict him, she didn't raise the rent, she simply made him a tenant, and that, to Margaret, was the most powerful form of balance she could imagine. Not punishment. Position. She watched from a distance as her children began to sense the quiet shift in the world around them. Christine's firm had just lost a major contract to a non-profit Margaret had anonymously backed. Robert's company received a grant under strict ethical terms he could no longer twist. Alan was now paying rent to an entity he couldn't track. None of them knew she was behind it all, but they felt it. The floor beneath their feet had shifted, and they didn't know why. Margaret wasn't trying to make them suffer. She just wanted them to stop standing on her shoulders while pretending they had climbed some mountain on their own. She hosted her first charity event under the Rosewood Foundation that month. It was held in an old restored gallery, lined with art from underrepresented women, tables draped in soft linen, candles flickering in elegant glass. The guest list was exclusive: educators, social workers, single mothers, youth activists. Margaret moved through the room with grace, wearing a navy dress and diamond earrings that once belonged to her mother. No one called her mom. Number 1 remembered the woman who used to wash the same dress 3 times a week to make it look new. They only knew the woman who had built something meaningful. She gave a short speech that night. She didn't talk about her past. She talked about second chances, about how kindness wasn't a gift, it was a responsibility, about how sometimes the most powerful people in the world were the ones no one bothered to see. After the event, one of the guests approached her quietly. You have a certain fire in you, she said, like someone who's been through something but came out holding the match. Margaret smiled. Sometimes, you have to set your past on fire just to see who survives the smoke. They both laughed. The next morning, she received another message from Ava. Mom says she wants to talk. She cries a lot when she thinks we don't notice. I think she's scared you won't forgive her. I told her you're strong, but not mean. I hope I was right. Margaret folded the letter carefully. She sat at her desk and wrote a reply. Just one line. Tell her strength isn't the absence of penance, the refusal to stay broken. She mailed it with a pressed flower tucked inside. That same afternoon, she visited her old neighborhood one last time. The streets hadn't changed much, the same cracked sidewalks, the same dented mailboxes. She walked past her old neighbors' homes, past the school her children once attended, and finally stopped in front of the bakery that had closed years ago. In its place was a laundromat, but the smell of yeast and sugar still lingered in her memory. An old woman sitting on a bench nearby looked up and nodded. You looked familiar, she said. Maybe, Margaret replied softly. You live around here. Used to. Left for something better. Huh. Margaret smiled. Left to become better. The woman nodded knowingly. Well, whatever you did, it looks good on you. Margaret thanked her, then turned and walked away. The world was finally beginning to see her not as the poor widow, not as the burden, not as the forgotten woman left behind. But as someone who had returned, not to beg for a place, but to buy the table. She no longer waited for the phone to ring. She no longer wondered if they regretted it. She was no longer afraid of being alone, because now, she knew power didn't come from wealth. It came from the ability to walk away from the people who once made you feel small and build something greater without ever asking for their permission. Asterisk rain fell gently against the windows of Margaret Hill's cottage, rhythmic and soft like a lullaby for the earth. She sat curled in her armchair near the fireplace, a knitted shawl draped around her shoulders, her fingers resting on the edge of a half-read book. She wasn't reading anymore, though. Her eyes had drifted past the words and out the window, watching as the rain kissed the blossoms she had planted weeks ago. Lavender, peonies, rosemary, all blooming now, despite the cold, despite everything. Her thoughts weren't in the garden or on the pages of her book. They were in the envelope that had arrived earlier that day. Inside was a formal invitation, printed on expensive paper. The font, neat and serifed at the top, in gold-embossed letters, were the words, *The Hill Family Reunion, hosted by Christine and Alan Hill. Margaret read it twice. There was no handwritten message, no apology, no warmth in the words. It was more of a statement than an invitation, as if to say, "We're gathering again, and we'll allow you to witness it." She'd heard through her quiet network that Christine's business had taken a sharp financial hit after a silent partner withdrew. Alan's development project had stalled due to zoning issues. Robert's name had appeared in a minor scandal involving investor funds, though it had been quickly swept under the rug. Margaret had not intervened, not yet. But now they wanted a reunion, and she knew what it meant. She was no longer just the mother they'd cast aside. She was now someone they suspected had become more than she let on. Ava, sweet and loyal Ava, must have said something. Or perhaps one of them had pieced the puzzle together after their separate brushes with the Rosewood Foundation. Perhaps they had begun to wonder how, after years of invisibility, the woman they abandoned had found such reach, such quiet influence. Margaret considered tossing the invitation into the fire, but she didn't. Instead, she set it beside her tea and stood slowly, her joints stiff from the rainy weather. She walked to the mirror in her hallway, the one framed in carved walnut that James had given her for their 25th anniversary. She looked at her reflection, not searching for beauty or flaws, but for truth. The woman staring back was no longer fragile. She was seasoned, deliberate, powerful. Her eyes held years of grief, yes, but also the calm of someone who had survived the storm and learned to walk beneath the thunder. She smiled slightly. Then she made a decision. The reunion was scheduled for Saturday afternoon at a private hall downtown, a place she remembered from old charity galas and retirement parties. It was fancy, no doubt, but sterile, with chandeliers that looked like they belonged in catalogs more than memories. She had no intention of making an entrance. She would make a statement. She arrived precisely on time, stepping out of a discreet black car provided by the foundation. She wore a cream-colored dress coat over a silk blouse and tailored slacks. Her hair pulled into an elegant bun, and a pearl necklace resting just above her collarbone. Her heels were modest, but each step echoed confidence. The valet opened the door, offering his hand. Thank you, she said, her voice calm and poised. Inside the hall, her children were already gathered. Alan in a navy suit, Christine in a designer dress, and Robert in a pale gray blazer that made him look more like a politician than a brother. The room had been dressed with flower arrangements and soft music, as if pretending to be a family again could be orchestrated with ambiance. The moment they saw her, their expressions shifted. Christine blinked, clearly not expecting her to look so composed. Alan's eyes widened for a split second, then narrowed, calculating. Robert's jaw clenched. Ava, however, lit up like the sun. She ran to Margaret, wrapping her arms around her waist. Grandma, she whispered. You came. Margaret embraced her gently, her heart swelling. I wouldn't miss you for the world, she said. The others approached slowly. Mom, Christine said, attempting a smile. You look amazing. Elegant, Robert added, trying to mask his discomfort. Alan gave her a curt nod. Glad you could make it. She didn't thank them. She didn't flatter or fumble. She simply smiled. I was curious, she said. That's all. Curious. Christine echoed. To see what a family looks like after it's forgotten its roots. Margaret replied softly, looking around. The words settled like mist in the room. Christine shifted. Mom, we didn't mean asterisk. Margaret raised a hand. It's all right. I didn't come for explanations. I came for clarity. Asterisk. Alan cleared his throat. Look, we know things weren't handled well in the past. We were younger, overwhelmed, and selfish. Asterisk. Margaret tilted her head slightly. Do you know what overwhelmed me? Watching my children become strangers. Not because I changed, but because I lost the currency you valued most, money. Robert opened his mouth, then closed it again. Christine looked genuinely ashamed. Mom, we were wrong. Asterisk. Yes, Margaret said. You were there. Was a long pause. Then Alan stepped forward, his tone shifting. You've done well for yourself. We've noticed. The Rosewood Foundation, some of the donations, the properties. We thought maybe you had help. Asterisk. Margaret met his eyes. No one helped me. I helped myself. Asterisk. You started a foundation? Robert asked. How? I won the lottery, she said simply. Christine gasped. Alan looked stunned. Asterisk. All this time, she whispered. Asterisk. Double quotes. Yes. And I claimed it quietly. Built something from it. Something with purpose. Not for revenge. Not to impress you, but to prove to myself that I was never the failure you made me feel like. Asterisk. Ava's eyes sparkled. I knew you were amazing. Margaret smiled and kissed her forehead. I'm not here to fight, she said. But I want to be clear. You don't get to rewrite the story now. You don't get to act like you stood by me when you didn't. You don't get to take credit for the woman I became in your absence. Asterisk. Christine's eyes welled with tears. Can we start again? Asterisk. Margaret paused. Then looked at Ava. With her, she said. Yes, with you perhaps. But you'll have to earn it. Asterisk. Robert exhaled deeply. What does that mean? Asterisk. It means show up. Not for appearances. Not when it's convenient. But when it matters. Asterisk. They nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. She didn't stay long. She hugged Ava tightly, whispered something into her ear, and kissed her cheek. Then she turned and walked out of the hall, leaving behind the chandeliers, the catering, the facade. Asterisk. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sun was beginning to break through the clouds, casting soft gold across the pavement. Her driver opened the door. Asterisk. Margaret climbed in, exhaled, and smiled, not because she'd confronted her past, but because she had finally become untouchable to it. Asterisk. She had walked into the very heart of where her pain had started, and walked out whole, not bitter, not broken. But brilliant. Asterisk. The morning after the reunion was still and quiet, as if the world had paused to let Margaret Hill breathe. Dew clung to the petals in her garden, sparkling in the gentle sun like tiny jewels. Birds chirped faintly in the distance, and the air was filled with the scent of moist earth and blooming lavender. Margaret sat on her front porch wrapped in a light cardigan, sipping from a porcelain teacup with a small crack in the rim. One of the few things she had kept from her old house. She hadn't slept much, not because she was restless, but because something inside her had finally settled. Asterisk. The night before had not been about confrontation or spectacle. It had been about closure, truth, not drama. And in speaking the words she had held in her heart for years, Margaret had liberated herself from the last thread tying her to the pain of her past. Her children's stunned silence, their hesitant apologies, their realization that the woman they had once discarded had risen far beyond their reach. It had not wounded her. It had affirmed her. Asterisk. But closure is not always the final chapter. Sometimes it's the beginning of the end, a time when choices must be made not for justice or redemption, but for legacy. Asterisk. Margaret set her teacup down and picked up a small wooden box from the side table. Inside were 3 envelopes, sealed with red wax, each with a name handwritten in her graceful cursive. Christine, Alan, and Robert. They were not letters of forgiveness or sentiment. They were instructions, directives, truths that needed to be passed forward, not as a mother to her children, but as a woman to 3 adults who had once forgotten what love and respect truly meant. Asterisk. She had written them over several weeks, carefully, never out of anger. She had waited until the storm in her soul had cleared, and all that remained was clarity. Asterisk. Later that day, she drove to the city herself. No driver, no foundation assistance. Just her and the road. The act felt important, like she was delivering not just messages, but symbols. She dropped the letters off one by one, placing them directly into each of their mailboxes. No ceremony, no confrontation. Asterisk she returned home, as the sky began to turn amber and lavender. There was something sacred about doing hard things quietly, she thought. Asterisk that evening. She lit candles in the sitting room and played a record James had loved, old jazz, soft and steady. She sat with her journal, flipping through the pages of thoughts, sketches, newspaper clippings, letters from Ava. The cottage felt warmer than ever before, filled not with memories but with meaning. And then her phone rang. She hesitated. It rarely rang. Only a few people had the number. She picked it up. Grandma. Ava's voice, bright and breathless. Asterisk Margaret smiled instantly. Hello, my sweet girl. Asterisk I got accepted into the summer program you told me about, the writing one. Asterisk Margaret's heart swelled. That's wonderful. Asterisk they said. A donor from the Rosewood Foundation sponsored my scholarship. Do you know who that is? She teased. Asterisk I might have an idea, Margaret said gently. Asterisk Mom cried when she found out. Ava said, her voice softer now. She's been different lately, quieter. I think she's thinking a lot. Asterisk she has a lot to think about, Margaret replied. But that's a good thing. Asterisk will you come to my end of program reading? It's in August. I'm going to read one of my stories. The one about the woman who hides her crown in a shoebox until she remembers who she is. Asterisk Margaret laughed, a sound like wind chimes. That sounds like someone I know. Asterisk they spoke a little longer, about writing, about books, about the cat that kept visiting Ava's window. When they hung up, Margaret sat still for a long time, holding the phone in her lap. Asterisk her legacy was already growing, not through money or real estate or foundations, but through Ava, through the quiet, rebellious flame she had passed down to her granddaughter. Asterisk the next week, the letters she had delivered finally bore fruit. Asterisk Christine arrived first. Unannounced, she stood at Margaret's front door in a grey trench coat, holding a pie. Asterisk I didn't know what to bring, she said awkwardly. I thought maybe, this time I could be the one showing up. Margaret opened the door wide. They sat in the kitchen over coffee and pie, the silence between them no longer jagged. Christine talked about her regrets, not as excuses, but as confessions. She admitted she had always felt like love was conditional, that if she failed, she would be unloved. Margaret listened without judgment. Then, gently, she reminded her daughter that her failure had not been in falling short, but in walking away. Asterisk Christine cried, and Margaret let her. Asterisk the next day, Robert came. He didn't cry. He didn't bring anything. He just sat on the edge of the porch and said, I was wrong. Asterisk Margaret joined him with 2 cups of tea. They talked about his children, his marriage, how fear had shaped so much of who he became. He apologized for saying nothing when she needed him to speak. She thanked him for finally finding his voice. Asterisk Alan came last, always the proudest. The letter had shaken him most. He had spent a week calling Rourke, digging into the ownership of the apartment complex, the real estate deals, the blind investments. He had uncovered enough to confirm what he suspected. His mother had never disappeared. She had simply risen beyond his sight. Asterisk he didn't come to the porch. He stood by the garden, looking at the rosemary bush. Asterisk you bought the building, he said, made me your tenant. Margaret nodded from the steps. I didn't do it to punish you, she said. I did it to remind you that the ground beneath your feet doesn't belong to you unless you've earned it. Alan looked at her for a long time. I haven't earned your forgiveness, he said. Asterisk no, she replied, but you've begun to earn my attention again. Asterisk they stood in silence for several minutes before he finally turned to go. As he walked away, Margaret whispered, I still love you, Alan, but I don't need you anymore, and that's the difference. Asterisk in the following months, Margaret began to prepare her final transition. She appointed Ava as a youth board advisor to the Rosewood Foundation, guiding initiatives for education and creative arts. She created a trust for local women-led businesses. She donated anonymously to the hospice that had cared for James, even began writing her memoirs, 1 page at a time, under the title, The Shoebox Crown. Asterisk she wasn't dying, she was blooming, but she wanted everything in place. Asterisk, and then one day, she took one final walk. Asterisk she returned to her original neighborhood, dressed simply. She passed the houses where she had once been invisible. She stopped in front of her old church, where she had once volunteered to mop floors and hand out programs. The building had closed down, but the steps remained. She sat there, watching the sun descend. Asterisk a little girl walked past holding her father's hand. She looked at Margaret and smiled. Margaret smiled back. You look like a queen, the girl said. Margaret's eyes sparkled. Asterisk, thank you, darling. I am. Asterisk, that night, she returned home, made a cup of hot cocoa, and stood at the window one last time. She thought of everything she had lost, everything she had rebuilt, everything she had reclaimed. They had disowned her for being poor, thinking that without money, she was nothing. But what they never understood was that Margaret Hill had always been rich. Rich in resilience, rich in love, rich in the kind of power no bank could store. Asterisk, she won the lottery. Yes, but more than that, she won herself. And that was the greatest fortune of all. Asterisk,